Hello everyone, my name is Bangerz, welcome back to the Method YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about the top 10 best performing DPS specs in Castle Nathria right now. These rankings are based purely on statistical data from Warcraft logs, with some of my own opinions thrown into why I think they do and why I think they don't perform well in Shadowlands, and of course mainly Castle Nathria. Here at Method obviously we do hate elitism. You should obviously just play 100% whatever you think is the most fun thing to do in the game, because if you don't enjoy it then what's the bother playing, right? With that being said, let's get right into the rankings starting from number 10. So, at the number 10 spot we have the Retribution Paladin. I'm going to go over 3 topics of why I think this class is at the spot it's at. So we're going to start with why this spec performs so well in the raids. So Retribution does play like a 1 minute sort of CD spec with the Curian ability Divine Toll. This in most cases is combined with Execution Sentence, Seraphim and Final Reckoning to do either massive priority damage or massive AoE every minute. This has actually worked out quite well in the raid because a lot of the counters do actually have some sort of ads spawned every minute or damage increase close to 1 minute intervals such as just Sludge Fists, etc, etc. What are the best things about playing this spec in Shadowlands? I mean, Paladins bring a lot of utility to the raids in the form of their different auras, Blessing of Protection, Lay on Hands and Blessing of Sacrifice, so they actually are really good to have in the raid. What are things that could be nerfed about this spec? So nerfing their very overpowered cooldown such as Avenging Wrath. However, this spec is in quite a delicate spot right now as most of their overall damage is coming from their cooldowns. So if we nerf their cooldowns, they're going to be pretty, their DPS is going to be hindered quite a lot. What are the worst things about this spec in Shadowlands? Waiting for cooldowns to come back to do any relevant damage. So Ret Paladins at the moment aren't really doing much damage unless they've got Avenging Wrath up. So they're not really doing much damage outside their cooldowns. And what are the things that could be buffed about this spec? So yeah, their damage outside the wings. If they buff the damage outside their wings, then Rets would be really, really strong and would actually probably be one of the top melees in the raid. So they're quite cooldown reliant at the moment. So this is why the Ret Paladin is in number 10. And in the number 9 spot is the Fury Warrior. So we're going to do the same as like we did with the Ret Paladin. We're going to go through why I think that the Fury Warrior is in the number 9 spot. So why the spec performs quite well is because the damage is very consistent. There's no real huge burst spikes, so the overall consistent damage is very good. It's not like a fire mage with combust, etc. The damage is like very consistent. What are the best things about playing this spec in Shadowlands is the smooth rotation. And there's always something to do, so having no downtime makes the spec very engaging. There's nothing worse than sitting there waiting for things to come off cooldown to press. What are things that could be nerfed about this spec? Very little right now, as the spec has only just begun performing quite well due to the recent buffs to Fury Warrior. But it is still quite a fairly neutral performer across the raid as a whole. However, they are getting stronger. What are the worst things about the spec in Shadowlands? It's relating to the other sort of things. There's no impactful DPS cooldown, like the Ret Paladin we just spoke about with the Avenging Wrath. The cooldowns on a Fury Warrior are quite weak, but you do obviously have quite a good legendary with the Signet of Tormented Kings. What are things that can be buffed about this spec? Single target is still pretty weak by all accounts. Luckily, Castle Nathria doesn't really have that many single target fights. But the thing is about the Fury Warrior is that the AoE is so good that it's hard to buff the single target without making the AoE go even stronger. So this is why we've got the Fury Warrior at number 9. And in the number 8 spot we have the Feral Druid. We don't really see many of these around. However, they are actually doing quite good this year with the good single target buffs. So let's go into why I think the Feral Druid is at the number 8. We don't actually have any really good Feral Druids at the moment in our guild, so getting this information has been a little bit difficult, but I've done a little bit of research and I hopefully can give you an insight of why I put the Feral Druid at number 8. So why the spec performs so well is because of their solid burst damage through Berserk and the fact that they have quite high mobility. Being a Feral Cat, you have dash, you have the Stampede and Roar, etc, etc. What are the best things about playing this spec in Shadowlands? You are finally doing some pretty good single target damage, which makes Feral somewhat a consideration for making the 20 members in a raid team. If you looked at the logs, you can see like on Sludge Fists and stuff with Berserk, they actually do quite a lot of single target damage, especially in big burst windows. One of the things that could be nerfed about this spec is obviously the burst single target damage could be nerfed. However, that is what is making Feral pretty strong at the moment, so if they did nerf that, we would then be in the same predicament where we're not really seeing any Feral Druids again, unless it's PvP. What are the worst things about this spec in Shadowlands? You still aren't really better than most to the melee because of your lack of toolkit. All you bring to the raid really is a stampeding brawl, which is just brought by the boomkins, which are normally way better anyway. So really, to bring a feral druid, unless they just really make the damage insane, they need to have something in their toolkit worth bringing. And what things could be buffed about this spec? The burst AoE is lacking a little bit, and also the playstyle is very different to most other classes. Some people may enjoy this, but some people may find this difficult to get used to. So I don't know, maybe this is not for everyone. But this is why I have put the feral druid number 8. They are really strong. We just still aren't seeing as many as I'd like to see at the moment to give a full information about the feral druid. And in the 7th spot we have the Shadow Priest. So why is this spec performing so well? Shadow Priest actually do have pretty good priority damage. You can talent into certain things which give you good switch damage. And Shadow Priest is also one of the highest simming single target specs in the game right now. The only reason they fell off a little bit towards the end of Castle Nathria is because of the fights like Stone Legion Generals, where it's a lot of like, you know, cleave. Sire, they weren't really that good for P3. So this is why they fell off a little bit, but early bosses Shadow Priesters were actually pretty strong. One of the best things about playing this spec in Shadowlands is you can finally do some good burst AoE damage on a Shadow Priest with Syrian Nightmare. Something Shadow Priests have usually lacked is the burst AoE damage, so it makes them also pretty good in Mythic Plus as well now. What are things that could be nerfed about this spec? There's not really much that needs to be nerfed about this spec. It's in a pretty good spot right now. It's just let's get rid of PI for the best of everyone. That's all I say about this spec. What are the worst things about this spec in Shadowlands is the moving and DPSing. Isn't very good on a Shadow Priest unless you're in your Void form. And what are the things that could be buffed about this spec is Cleave's quite good on a Shadow Priest, but the problem is it's not as good as an MN Hunter, an Affliction Warlock, or a Boomkin. So this is why they fall off in the raid compared to these classes. So maybe a little buff to their Cleave damage, but it is still pretty good. It's just not as good as most of the range classes, even the Fire Mage and stuff. And in the number 6 spot we have the Unholy Death Knight. Why this spec is actually performing so well in raids is that, one, it has one of the best executes in the game at the moment. At 35% it has something called Soul Reaper, which is really strong. They have one of the strongest cooldowns in the game in Army of the Dead, so that really helps them pump DPS as well. And they also bring one of the best raid cooldowns in the game with AMZ, which is a 20% reduction in magic damage. So they are really good. I mean, every top guild had at least 3 to 4 Death Knights on near enough every single boss, so that just shows how good the Death Knights are. But they aren't really pumping the most damage at the moment in the raid, which is why they're at the 6th spot, but they are one of the best to have in the raid. What are the best things about playing this spec? So I asked one of our DKs, Corella, this question, and her only reply was because you have a pet ghoul. So I don't think DKs are the most funnest classes to be playing at the moment. I mean, most of your damage is just through pets, but yeah, that's that. What are the things that could be nerfed about this spec? It's probably the Soul Reaper damage, or the AMZ. I think having the best execute in the game and one of the best raid cooldowns in the game is a bit too overpowered. So yeah, maybe one of them could get nerfed. What are the worst things about this spec at the moment? So mobility. DKs have never been one with good mobility. And also an Unholy DK takes quite a lot of GCDs to switch on a target, so they're not very good on like the attendant on cancel and things like that. So maybe they could get like that's quite annoying. That's never really that great for progress where you're not good at switching targets. And obviously the thing that could be buffed about this spec is your mobility. Like if one of our DKs get the reverberating eruption on Stone Legion Generals and it's the far one, you always think that it's just not going to get put in place because their mobility is just not that good. But overall, the DK is a very solid pick to have in your raids. Before we get back into the content, did you know that over 55% of you aren't subscribed and only 5% of you enable the bell to know when we upload? If you are enjoying this content, hey, consider subscribing and enable that bell to know when we upload. Plug over, let's get back into the content. And in number 5 we have the Marksmanship Hunter. It's your boy's Bangerz spec. It's what I play, so we'll go through exactly why I think that the Marksman Hunter is in number 5. So why this spec performs so well is just literally purely on because of how overpowered Wild Spirits is and our 3 to 5 target cleave. Single target for MM Hunters are not that great unless you've got PI, so we really do excel when there's more than 3 targets. What are the best things about playing this spec in Shadowlands is I think is the amount of burst damage you can do. So let's just use an example as in Nerva. When the ads spawn, if you've got PI and your Wild Spirits, you can literally kill them ads with only having to do 2 interrupts instead of 5 interrupts. So you're basically nullifying a whole mechanic on a boss. So it is really good. And you're also pretty mobile if you play around your aim shots right. I mean, that's the only thing you really have to cast. as an Hunter. A steady shot, arcane shots, rapid fire, you can all do on the move. What are the things that could be nerfed about this spec? Is obviously wild spirits, but the only problem is if you did that, no one would literally play Hunter because it's the only thing that is making Hunter worth taking right now. So I think Hunter is actually in a pretty good state right now. What are the worst things about this spec is relying on aim shot crits. You basically need aim shot crits to do any good single target damage, and it's never really fun to pray for RNG while you're killing a boss. What are things that could be buffed about this spec? This is a hard question because if you buff anything single target with Hunter, you're also buffing their AoE. So they're in a good spot at the moment where you don't. If you nerf Dame Shot, their single target would be useless. If you buff Dame Shot, their single target would be good, and their AoE would be even better. So it is a really hard thing to do. So at the moment, I think Hunters are in a pretty nice spot, and they're also performing really well in raids because of Wild Spirits. In the number 4 spot, we have the Fire Mage. Why this spec is performing so well is it because it brings good single target damage and also really good AoE burst damage. This is very valuable on harder bosses such as Sludge, Generals, Sire. They were really good on all these bosses. Not so much Generals because of the shield damage on progress, but they are now really good in the raid because the shields are not as important. They were initially quite weak early on due to low gear and haste, but now they've become really strong with mythic gear. One of the best things about playing this spec in Shadowlands is they are quite tanky with their shields. Also the fact that you can excel at both single target and AoE, and the mobility. However, mobility wasn't really that important in this tier except for Generals when you want to be backup soak. What are things that could be nerfed by this spec is obviously definitely the target cap with Flame Strike. Fire Mages are used in all Mythic Plus groups, push groups, because they're uncapped. Flame Strike is just doing insane damage. And they could also probably get a Kindling nerf. The talent in general is very cookie cutter, it's quite weird and annoying to play with. What are the worst things about this spec in Shadowlands is the Ignite is really underwhelming. And one of the things that I hate the most is that Phoenix Flames isn't a guaranteed crit like it used to be. This feels very weird. Because it used to always be 100% crit, and also you nearly have to have uptime, 100% uptime on fireballs to guarantee 1 minute combustions. That isn't a very fun playstyle at all. So yeah, one thing that could be buffed about this spec is a whole redesign. Ignite feels very poor. It's also very problematic to balance since we saw in BFA how broken Ignite can be, even pre-corruption. For starters, I'd want basically the BFA Ignite to return, auto spread and back to how it used to be, and you know, the Fire Mage spreading this Ignite everywhere like it used to be back in the day, instead of just spamming fireballs into combustions. So, taking the bronze medal in 3rd place is the Windwalker Monk. So why this spec does perform so well is because they do have high on demand burst with very high cleave damage, but then they also have very solid single target damage as well. So what are the best things about playing this spec in Shadowlands is the usage of abilities feels very smooth. This including high mobility and high burst damage. I mean, having high burst damage is always a really satisfying thing, and wow, when you're pumping with all your cooldowns up, there's nothing better. There's no better feeling than that. What are the things that could be nerfed about this spec is the 3 to 4 target cleave. That goes with the insane conduit calculated strikes and the talent dance of Chi-Ji. Having all of these inside your storm, earth and fire does bring some big pump of DPS. What are the worst things about this spec in Shadowlands is the single target rotation. That goes with the talent hit combo, which is sometimes really slow, so you're waiting for things. Also, the general thing about Windwalker Monk not scaling that well into an expansion is also something to worry about. What are the things that could be buffed about this spec is scaling of stats, like we just spoke about for Windwalker. Normally Windwalkers are always really good at the start of an expansion, however they start to fall off as the tiers go on because of stats and other classes getting a lot more gear. Taking the silver medal is the Boomkin. So in number 2 spot is the Druid Boomkin. This spec is performing really well. They have super strong single target and good AoE. This is mainly because of a legendary called Balance of All Things, which does buff their damage by quite a lot. The best thing about playing this spec in Shadowlands is just the fact that you can press Convoke with the spirits and do absurd amounts of damage. You're also really tanky. You have a 1 minute defensive cooldown in Bark Skin, and you have Bear Form, which is also really strong. What are the things that could be nerfed about this spec? Convoke could probably be nerfed a little bit. Also the fact of how hard your Star Surges crit for. This is also a big part in PvP as well, but we'll keep this video mainly just into Castle Nathria. What are the worst things about this spec? So on progress sometimes as well, like when we had our Druids convoking, the things with the convoke sometimes hit the targets you didn't want it to hit, or you don't get a full moon in your convoke or something like that. That's always a feels bag. What are the things that could be buffed about this spec? The spec in general is obviously in a really good spot right now, so I wouldn't say anything needs buffing. Like, any buff to this spec right now would just make it far too OP. They're good at everything in the raids, which is why they're in a number 2 spot. And taking the golden spot in number 1 is the Affliction Warlock. So this spec is performing really well in raids right now. It performs so well because currently Affliction is very good in fights with consistent 1 to 3 targets, and I mean Castle Nathria, almost all fights are 1 to 3 except the odd occasion Sun King and Stone Legion generals. But yeah, even on these bosses it's still really good because the shade phase on Sun King when you're blasting the shields is absurd, and Stone Legion generals with priority damage on generals and Goliath, you're also doing really good damage. So they are still really good in these fights, but they might not just be at the top of your meters at the end of the fight. What are the best things about playing a spec in Shadowlands? The best things about it is that it's quite a complicated spec to play. So when you're playing it perfectly, it's really satisfying, not only because you've played it well, but also because you'll see the impact on your damage meter. A good Affliction Warlock will really pump in this raid, but you will also kind of notice a bad Affliction Warlock because you have to get it right to do good damage. What are the things that could be nerfed about this spec? I think the main problem about Affliction Warlock right now is that it's really hard to nerf because you're basically doing your single target rotation in your cleave as well. So if you nerf the single target, you're nerfing the cleave, and if you nerf the cleave, you're nerfing the single target damage. But Affli's cleave 2 to 3 target damage is just crazy. What are the worst things about this spec in Shadowlands? The worst part about Affliction is for sure the atrocious target switching it has. So like a bit like the Unholy DK, the attendants for example, when they're spawning and run to the boss, you just really can't touch them. There's not really much you can do. You have to just leave it to your hunters etc. to do that. So it does feel really bad when playing that sort of scenario. What are the things that could be buffed about this spec? Your burst AoE damage. So it's like your other specs like your hunters where you can just pop wild switch and do absurd damage. As an Affliction Warlock, you don't really have that big AoE because the time you've planned everything, you've got it all set up to do big AoE, the mobs are usually dead. So that is probably the only thing that I would say would need buffing in this spec, but you can't have it all right. They've got the best single target pretty near enough, the best cleave. You can't have it all because then your class would just be like, you know, be ridiculous. So yeah, at number 1 spot is the Affliction Warlock. They are really strong. And there we have it, the top 10 performing DPS specs right now in Castle Nathria. Let us know in the comments below what you've played through your own progress and how you felt about your class and spec. I would also like to give a good shout out to my guildies too, who helped give me some information on some of these classes I don't actually currently play myself. Unfortunately, due to the current state of the game with loot, I'm only playing 2 classes at the moment, with the Warlock and the Hunter. So yeah, I've had to get a little bit of information on some of these classes. That's all from me today though. Once again, I am Bangerz, but you can find me more at twitch.tv/Bangerz, or my Twitter, twitter.com/methodbangers. Thank you so much for watching, have an amazing day and stay safe guys.